Hey everybody, time for Mr. Rogers. All right, we were on chapter 8, tackling tough issues. Do you poop? Fred got used to answering that question. Kids asked it all the time. They also wanted to know things like how he got in and out of the TV set. Fred tried to answer everything honestly and directly. He read every letter he got and he always wrote back. Sometimes he sat up late at night with Joanne and together they worked through the mail. It was slow going. They kept stopping to read the letters out loud to each other. But Fred got a lot of new ideas for shows from those letters. There was nothing too small or too big for him to talk about. Discussing difficult topics made some adults want to change the subject, not Fred. He talked about war in 1968 when the United States was in a war with Vietnam, and again during the Gulf War with Iraq in the early 1990s. He also tackled divorce, reassuring children that it wasn't their fault if their parents split up. Fred knew children got sad, angry, and anxious just like adults did. Talking things out usually made people feel better. But Fred didn't always use words. Some things didn't need explaining, they just needed doing. One of the first people Fred added to the neighborhood cast was an African-American man named Francois Clemens, who played a policeman. One hot afternoon, Mr. Rogers had a wading pool set up in his backyard. He invited Officer Clemens to sit down and relax for a bit. They took off their shoes and socks and soaked their feet in the cool water together. Not long before this show aired, it had been perfectly legal to prevent black people from sharing the same swimming pools or beaches with white people. That had only changed after the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964. Some white people still looked down on African Americans, but Fred believed everyone should be treated the same. He didn't say a word about it, but he made it clear when he put his feet next to Officer Clemens's in the pool. The Civil Rights Movement. Even though slavery, the act of owning another person, was made illegal in 1865, black people still did not have many rights in many places. African Americans could not vote or own houses. They could not attend the same schools as white people or use the same bathrooms. During the Civil Rights Movement of the 1950s and 1960s, African Americans joined together to protest this treatment. They held marches to demand equal rights. Some white people were angry about it, but many others supported the cause. The Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964. It guaranteed the same rights for all Americans. And that was what Mr. Rogers was trying to emphasize, was that everybody was the same. Everybody should be treated equal. That's he and Officer Clemens. And then this is some of the protests that they're talking about. Okay. In 1968, two very important American leaders were assassinated. One was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a leader in the Civil Rights Movement. The other was Senator Robert Kennedy. He was the brother of President John F. Kennedy. Robert Kennedy had been running for president himself. Both King and Kennedy were killed because of their political beliefs. Fred knew kids were hearing a lot about the violence happening in their country. He worried about how they would handle it. Fred stayed up all night to tape a special show about the death of Robert Kennedy. During the program, Lady Aberlin talked with Daniel Striped Tiger to explain what had happened in the most gentle way that Fred could think of. At the end of the episode, Fred spoke directly to parents. "I plead for your protection and support of your young children," he said. "There is just so much that a very young child can take." Here's, so that's Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr., who are both shot and killed. And here's Daniel Tiger speaking with Lady Aberlin about it. Fred could not protect children from big problems like violence or death, but he tried to make these things less scary. When he was a child and something bad happened, Fred's mother had told him, "Look for the helpers. You will always find people who are helping." That's what Fred was doing, and that's what he was teaching kids to do. Chapter 9, A Powerful Voice. One day in 1969, Fred traveled to Washington, D.C. to talk to a committee of U.S. senators. At the time, public television received about $20 million per year from the government. President Richard Nixon had suggested cutting that amount in half to save money. That would be a huge loss for public television. Many programs would probably be canceled. It was not up to the president, though. Only Congress had the power to make that decision. Fred was invited to speak to the Senate committee. Maybe he could help save the funding for public television. Fred was good at talking to kids about important issues, but could he work his magic on adults? The senator in charge, John O. Pastor, was a gruff, no-nonsense person. For 2 days, he had already listened to many different people speak. Fred hoped Senator Pastore would want to hear what he had to say, too. A lot depended on it. Fred might have been nervous, but he did not let it show. He spoke about how violence on TV worried him. Then he explained how he used his program to help children talk about their feelings. I feel that if we in public television can only make it clear that feelings are mentionable and manageable, we will have done a great service, Fred said. Senator Pastore listened closely. Fred's words were having a big effect on him. I'm supposed to be a pretty tough guy, he said, and this is the first time I've had goosebumps for the last 2 days. When Fred finished speaking, the senator said, I think it's wonderful. Looks like you earned the $20 million. So he saved the funding. There's the senator. And here's Mr. Rogers addressing the committee. Fred sat back in his chair and smiled. He was so relieved. He had only talked to the committee for a few minutes, but it had been worth it. Now there would be enough money for him to keep making his program. Fred believed he was doing important work on the neighborhood. He was teaching lessons that would help kids become happy people. Sometimes they were very small lessons that didn't need much explaining. Once on the show, he buttoned his sweater wrong and it came out all crooked. Rather than shout cut and start over, Fred just laughed and fixed it on camera. Mistakes were part of life, and so was fixing them. The most important lesson was making sure kids understood that they did not have to do anything special in order to be special. That came just by being themselves. When he was asked why he devoted his life to children, Fred answered, well, the children become adults. He meant that when children grew up, they would remember their experiences from childhood. The things they learned as kids would determine how they acted as adults. Fred wanted to be sure he was sending positive messages to the children in his audience. Okay, and here's a picture after he was told that they would get to keep the money. All right, so looks like tomorrow we will read the last 2 chapters, maybe 3 chapters, and be done with Mr. Rogers. I hope you're listening to the books on tape because I'd like to talk about them when we meet during our Zoom meetings. So if you haven't been listening to them, you can always go back and listen to them. They're all on my YouTube channel, and they're all linked in Google Classroom. So that's all I have for you guys today. I miss you very much. I hope you're doing well, and I will record more reading for you tomorrow. Bye.